There is a quiet shift happening in the world right now, one that most people are not prepared to talk about honestly. And it is reshaping workplaces, relationships, and society itself. Men are changing how they move through the world, how they protect themselves, and how they interact with others, not out of hostility or anger, but out of learned caution. What you are about to hear is not speculation, not theory, and not ideology. It is pattern recognition built from years of observation. Stay with me to the very end because once you see what is happening clearly, you cannot unsee it, and it explains far more than just what is happening at work. Before we get into it, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all so you get every Angry Guy video the moment we release it. If you want to protect yourself financially and learn how to safeguard your assets and grow your wealth, check out Angry's Crypto Academy, where I break down how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly with real education instead of hype. The Academy is linked in the description, so go check it out now. And if you are enjoying these videos and want to support the channel directly, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It helps keep the lights on and the message going. Now, let us talk about what is really happening because what you are seeing right now did not come out of nowhere. Men are beginning to wear body cameras to work, not as a statement, not as a protest, but as a form of self preservation. This is not about control, intimidation, or power. This is about documentation. This is about men understanding that in the modern workplace, perception often matters more than truth, and that one unverified claim can erase a lifetime of effort in a matter of hours. Companies are uncomfortable with this. Human resources departments are openly hostile to it, and yet none of them want to talk about why men feel this step is necessary in the first place. For years, men were told to be more open, more communicative, more emotionally available, more present. They were told to speak carefully, to listen closely, to respect boundaries, to adapt, to evolve. And many did exactly that. But at the same time, the rules of engagement were being rewritten in a way that removed any margin for error. A misunderstanding became a violation. An awkward moment became intent. An accusation became guilt by default. And once that line was crossed, there was no meaningful path back. No real investigation. No balanced process. No assumption of innocence, just reputational damage, job loss, and social exile. So men adapted again, because men always adapt. They stopped engaging casually. They stopped mentoring informally. They stopped lingering conversations. They stopped being friendly in ways that could be misinterpreted. And now, some have taken the final logical step, which is recording interactions, so there is an objective record of reality. Not feelings, not interpretations, not narratives, reality. And the reaction to this has been revealing. Women do not like it. Companies do not like it. Human resources departments are furious. And that anger is telling because if everything was fair, transparent, and balanced, documentation would not be a threat. The only time evidence becomes uncomfortable is when it disrupts control over the narrative. Men did not create this environment. Men responded to it. And the uncomfortable truth is that this world was built deliberately over decades. One policy, one slogan, one campaign at a time. After the cultural reckoning that followed movements like Hash Me Too, men were told in no uncertain terms that silence was safer than presence. That distance was safer than engagement. That avoidance was safer than trust. Men were told that masculinity itself was suspect, that normal male behavior was something to be monitored, corrected, and restrained. And now that men have listened, truly listened, and adjusted their behavior accordingly, society is shocked by the outcome. Men are withdrawing, not dramatically, not loudly, quietly, professionally, efficiently. They are opting out of unnecessary risk. They are choosing solitude over exposure. They are choosing peace over validation. And the irony is that the same voices that told men to step back are now angry that men are gone. They are angry that men no longer volunteer for emotional labor, angry that men no longer initiate, angry that men no longer absorb consequences on behalf of others, angry that men no longer play a game where the rules can change after the fact. The trust between men and women did not erode overnight. It was burned down deliberately, accusation by accusation, headline by headline, viral clip by viral clip. Men watched other men lose everything over claims that were later questioned, retracted, or quietly forgotten after the damage was done. They watched reputations destroyed without due process. They watched careers end without evidence. And they learned a simple lesson that society refuses to acknowledge. When the cost of being wrong is annihilation, the rational response is avoidance. This is not about hatred. This is not about resentment. This is about risk management. Men are no longer willing to gamble their livelihoods, freedom, or future on the hope that someone else will be fair. They are trusting observable reality over assurances. They are trusting patterns over promises. And once that switch flips, it does not flip back. For decades, men were told they were not needed, that their presence was optional, that their contributions were replaceable, that their protection was unnecessary, that their leadership was oppressive, that their instincts were flawed. And now that men have internalized that message and stepped aside, the system is discovering something it never planned for. Men were the stabilizers, men absorbed chaos, men buffered reality, men made things work quietly in the background while being told they were the problem. Now that buffer is gone. And what we are seeing instead is panic. Panic in dating markets, panic in workplaces, panic in institutions that relied on male compliance without accountability. Women are openly expressing confusion and frustration about why things feel harder, lonelier, and more unstable. Many are demanding that men return, that men re engage, that men resume their former roles. But the reality is that men did exactly what they were told. They walked away. And here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. Men are not suffering the way society expected them to. Men are not collapsing in isolation. Men are not begging to come back. Many are reporting the opposite. They are calmer, they are more focused, they are spending less, they are simplifying their lives. They are rediscovering hobbies, health, and purpose without constant negotiation or emotional taxation. They learned that being alone is not the same as feeling alone. Men are minimalist by nature. When something becomes consistently harmful, inefficient, or hostile, men remove it. And once removed, they rarely return to it unless it proves its value again. Relationships, workplaces, and social expectations are now being evaluated under that same lens. Does this add peace or subtract it? Does this build or destabilize? Does this require constant defense or allow forward motion? And many things that once seemed normal are failing that test. This is why the idea of men wearing body cameras is not shocking if you understand the trajectory. It is not escalation. It is the final adaptation in a long chain of adaptations. Men were told not to trust their instincts. They were punished for misunderstanding signals. They were told intent did not matter, only impact. So now they are removing ambiguity entirely. And instead of asking why men feel this is necessary, institutions are trying to stop it. That resistance is the clearest confirmation of all, because evidence should protect everyone if the system is fair. Transparency should be welcomed if the goal is truth. But when control over interpretation matters more than facts, documentation becomes dangerous to the status quo. And men see that clearly now. This is not reversible. Trust is not rebuilt by demands. It is not restored by shaming. It is not repaired by pretending the past did not happen. Men have learned through experience that the safest move is disengagement. And disengagement, once normalized, becomes permanent. As you watch this unfold, ask yourself, who is actually struggling right now? Ask yourself who is demanding change, attention, and rescue. Ask yourself who is adapting calmly and who is panicking loudly, because the answers are not aligning with the narratives we were sold for decades. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. And this is only the beginning. What many people still do not understand is that this shift did not begin with body cameras. It began with silence. It began when men stopped correcting the record publicly because they learned that defending yourself often makes things worse. It began when men stopped explaining themselves because explanation was reframed as guilt. It began when men realized that no matter how carefully they spoke, how politely they behaved, or how much they complied, the outcome could still be catastrophic if someone decided to reinterpret an interaction after the fact. Silence became safer than speech. Distance became safer than engagement. And absence became safer than presence. Men watched as workplaces quietly transformed from environments of collaboration into environments of surveillance, not through cameras, but through social pressure. A stray glance could be redefined, a neutral comment could be reframed, a professional interaction could be replayed later with added intent that was never there. And men learned quickly that intent no longer mattered, only narrative mattered. Once that realization settled in, the way men moved through the world changed permanently. For decades, men were told that systems like family court, divorce court, and workplace compliance structures existed to ensure fairness. But what men experienced was not balance, it was asymmetry. Accusations required belief, while defense required proof. Claims required amplification, while evidence required permission. Men learned that the burden of innocence was theirs to carry, and that burden could never truly be set down once lifted. So men did what men have always done when confronted with a hostile environment. They adapted quietly, they reduced exposure, they stopped volunteering information, they stopped forming unnecessary attachments. They stopped engaging in behaviors that carried asymmetric risk. And when that was not enough, when even neutrality was no longer safe, documentation became the last line of defense. And this is why the reaction to men recording interactions is so revealing. The outrage is not rooted in safety, it is rooted in lost leverage. When there is a record, stories cannot evolve freely. When there is evidence, interpretations must compete with facts. And when facts exist, power shifts away from those who rely on ambiguity. Men understand this instinctively. They are not trying to dominate, they are trying to survive. At the same time this withdrawal has been happening, another trend has emerged that further confirms everything men already suspected. Women have taken to platforms like TikTok in massive numbers, openly documenting frustration, exhaustion, and confusion about why life feels harder now, why dating feels impossible, why financial pressure feels overwhelming, why support systems feel absent, why the world feels colder. And many of these videos contain an unspoken assumption that men will eventually return to fix things. But men are not returning, not because they cannot, but because they no longer see a reason to. Men were told explicitly that they were not needed. They were told that their presence was optional and often problematic. They were told that women were the table, that men were lucky to be invited, that contribution was expected, but appreciation was not. And men listened. They stepped back. They stopped offering what was no longer wanted. What happened next was predictable to anyone paying attention. The systems that relied on male participation without male authority began to strain. Dating markets collapsed into chaos. Workplaces lost informal mentorship. Social structures lost stability. Financial pressure increased. And instead of accountability, there was confusion. Instead of reflection, there were demands. Instead of asking what went wrong, society asked why men were not stepping up anymore. But stepping up requires trust. It requires reciprocity. It requires a belief that effort will not be punished retroactively. And that belief no longer exists for a growing number of men. Once trust is gone, duty becomes optional. Once duty becomes optional, men choose peace. This is where many people misunderstand what men walking away actually looks like. It is not bitterness. It is not rage. It is not constant complaint. It is calm. It is silence. It is men choosing smaller lives with fewer liabilities and more control. It is men realizing that happiness does not require external validation, romantic pursuit, or social approval. It is men discovering that peace is not found in constant negotiation, but in self containment. Men who walk away simplify. They reduce expenses. They avoid debt. They downsize homes. They limit obligations. They invest in health, hobbies, and personal growth. They stop chasing approval. They stop competing in rigged games. And they stop apologizing for opting out. What makes this particularly destabilizing for society is that men have historically absorbed excess demand. Men worked longer hours. Men took on dangerous jobs. Men paid disproportionate financial costs. Men accepted social risk. And they did so not because it was easy, but because they believed it was necessary. That belief is gone. Men no longer believe that sacrificing themselves benefits anyone but the system that exploits them. And once that realization takes hold, the calculus changes permanently. Men begin asking different questions. Does this job protect me? Does this relationship add value? Does this interaction carry unnecessary risk? Does this expectation respect my time and autonomy? And if the answer is no, men walk away without drama. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation fail. Shame requires buy in. It requires the target to care about the approval of the person applying it. Men walking away no longer do. They have emotionally exited systems that no longer reward engagement. An emotional exit always precedes physical exit. There's also an uncomfortable truth that many refuse to confront. Men did not suddenly change, men behaved consistently. What changed was how that behavior was interpreted and punished. Normal male behavior was reframed as suspect. Natural boundaries were reframed as hostility. Disinterest was reframed as entitlement. And once men realized that they could not win under those rules, they stopped playing entirely. This is why men are now choosing observable reality over verbal assurances. Words mean nothing without patterns to support them. Promises mean nothing without accountability. And trust means nothing without consequences for abuse. Men are no longer persuaded by slogans, they are persuaded by outcomes. And the outcomes speak clearly. Men who disengage report lower stress, lower anxiety, greater financial stability, improved mental health, stronger friendships with other men, more control over time, less conflict, more peace. These are not fringe cases. These are consistent reports across demographics. Once men experience this, the incentive to return disappears. Meanwhile, the narrative continues to insist that men are lonely, broken, and incomplete without constant romantic pursuit. But that narrative is increasingly contradicted by reality. Men are learning that companionship is optional, that fulfillment can be internal, that solitude can be restorative rather than isolating, and that happiness does not require constant emotional labor. This realization is particularly threatening to systems that depend on male attention and resources, because once men stop giving attention freely, its value increases. Once men stop spending money impulsively, Economic pressure shifts. Once men stop absorbing chaos, chaos becomes visible, and visibility leads to panic. This is why we are seeing such intense backlash against men who document interactions. It is not about policy, it is about control. It is about preventing men from protecting themselves in a way that cannot be easily manipulated. Because once men have proof, the old tactics lose power. The irony is that none of this required hostility. None of this required confrontation. Men simply listened. They followed instructions, they stepped back, they disengaged, and now the consequences are unfolding naturally. The world that exists today is the result of cumulative choices, of incentives rewarded, of behaviors encouraged, of protections removed. And men are responding rationally to that environment. You cannot punish a group repeatedly for participation and then be shocked when they opt out. What happens next is not a mystery. More men will choose documentation. More men will choose isolation. More men will choose minimalism. More men will choose self preservation over sacrifice. And the institutions that relied on their unacknowledged labor will continue to strain. This is not collapse driven by hatred, it is collapse driven by withdrawal. And withdrawal is far harder to reverse because it does not announce itself, it simply continues. As this continues, the gap between narrative and reality will grow wider. Demands will grow louder. Pressure will increase. But persuasion will fail because men no longer believe in the moral authority of the voices demanding their return. They have already built lives without those voices. And those lives, for many, are better. And this brings us to the part that no one wants to talk about honestly. Once men realize that they can be content without participation, society loses its leverage over them. And when leverage disappears, control disappears with it. This is why the panic feels disproportionate, because it is not about cameras. It is not about policy. It is about a quiet revolution of disengagement that cannot be shouted down or legislated away. Men are done negotiating their existence. They are done proving their innocence. They are done justifying their boundaries. And they are done sacrificing themselves for systems that do not protect them in return. They walked away and they are not looking back. One of the most misunderstood aspects of what is happening right now is the idea that men are somehow acting out of spite or revenge. That assumption reveals more about the observer than the men themselves. What is actually happening is far more ordinary and far more permanent. Men are optimizing their lives around predictability, stability, and peace. They are making decisions the same way they would in any other environment that becomes hostile or unreliable. When a system punishes participation and rewards withdrawal, withdrawal becomes the intelligent response. In previous generations, men tolerated a great deal of friction because there was a shared belief that effort led to outcomes worth protecting. There was an understanding that contribution would be recognized, that mistakes would be judged proportionally, and that loyalty had value. Those assumptions no longer hold. Men now operate in environments where effort is expected, but protection is conditional, where intentions are irrelevant, and where outcomes are determined after the fact by narrative rather than evidence. In such an environment, the only winning move is not to play. This is why so many men are choosing careers that minimize exposure. They are moving toward remote work, independent contracting, technical fields, and roles with limited interpersonal ambiguity. They are avoiding positions that rely heavily on perception management rather than measurable output. They are stepping away from leadership tracks that offer prestige but carry disproportionate risk. They are choosing quiet competence over visibility. And this shift is not driven by fear in the way people often frame it. It is driven by clarity. Fear is reactive, clarity is strategic. Men have assessed the terrain and adjusted accordingly. Once clarity replaces hope, behavior stabilizes. That is why this trend does not reverse. It is not emotional, it is structural. Institutions are struggling to respond because the old tools no longer work. Public messaging does not move men who have already disengaged emotionally. Moral appeals fail when moral authority has been undermined. Incentives fall flat when the cost of participation outweighs the reward. And enforcement mechanisms become counterproductive when they accelerate withdrawal rather than compliance. This creates a feedback loop that few are willing to acknowledge. As men disengage, systems become less stable. As systems become less stable, risk increases. As risk increases, more men disengage. And each cycle reinforces the next. This is not sudden collapse, it is gradual erosion. In the workplace, this erosion shows up as a lack of mentorship, a lack of initiative, and a lack of informal cooperation. Men still do their jobs. They still meet requirements, but they no longer go beyond what is written. They no longer volunteer ideas that could be misinterpreted. They no longer take responsibility for outcomes they cannot control. The invisible glue that once held teams together quietly dissolves. In social spaces, the erosion is even more visible. Men no longer initiate conversations. They no longer approach. They no longer take the lead in organizing, planning, or paying. They no longer provide the social momentum that once made interactions flow. And without that momentum, many spaces feel stagnant, tense, or transactional. This absence is often misinterpreted as apathy. It is not, it is intentional restraint. Men have learned that initiative carries risk, while passivity carries protection. And when protection becomes the priority, initiative disappears. What many people fail to grasp is that men did not lose their desire for connection. They lost their trust in the conditions under which connection occurs. Desire without trust becomes liability, and men are no longer willing to accept liability without safeguards. This is where the psychological shift becomes crucial. Once a man internalizes that his well being is his responsibility alone and that external systems may not protect him, his entire orientation changes. He becomes inward focused, he becomes selective, he becomes disciplined, and he becomes uninterested in approval that can be withdrawn arbitrarily. Men who reach the stage often describe a sense of relief rather than loss. The constant background tension fades. The need to perform disappears. The pressure to meet expectations that were never clearly defined evaporates. Life becomes quieter, simpler, more manageable. This is why calls for men to re engage often sound hollow. They appeal to a version of manhood that no longer exists. They assume a willingness to sacrifice that has been exhausted. They assume trust that has been broken. And they assume a sense of obligation that has been replaced with self stewardship. Another critical piece of this shift is pattern recognition. Men are increasingly relying on observed behavior rather than stated intent. They are watching outcomes instead of listening to explanations. They are comparing promises to results, and when patterns repeat, men adjust accordingly. This is not cynicism, it is learning. And once learned, it cannot be unlearned. A man who has seen how quickly circumstances can turn against him does not forget that lesson. He incorporates it into his decision making permanently. This is also why younger men are opting out earlier. They are watching what happened to older men and choosing avoidance from the start. They are skipping steps their fathers and older peers assumed were necessary. They are not interested in proving anything, they are interested in stability. You see this in lifestyle choices. Younger men are delaying or avoiding marriage, they are avoiding debt, they are avoiding public conflict, they are prioritizing skills that offer independence, they are forming smaller social circles with clearer boundaries, and they are unapologetic about it. This trend is often framed as immaturity or fear of commitment. That framing misses the point entirely. This is not avoidance of responsibility, it is refusal to accept asymmetric risk. There is a difference. A responsibility implies agency and reward. Risk without agency is exposure. Men are no longer confusing the two. As this continues, the gap between expectations and reality grows. Many still expect men to behave as they did decades ago, absorbing cost without complaint. But those expectations are no longer aligned with incentives. And when incentives and expectations diverge, behavior always follows incentives. This is why attempts to shame men for withdrawing backfire. Shame relies on shared values. But men who have disengaged no longer share the values of systems that punish them. They have created their own value frameworks centered on autonomy, peace, and self respect. External judgment simply does not penetrate. What replaces it is indifference, and indifference is far more destabilizing than opposition. Opposition can be argued with, indifference cannot. The concept of men walking away is often misunderstood as a movement or ideology. It is neither, it is an emergent behavior. It arises naturally when conditions make engagement costly and withdrawal beneficial. There is no leader, no manifesto, no organization, just millions of individual decisions made independently but consistently. That is what makes it unstoppable. There is nothing to negotiate with, nothing to dismantle, nothing to ban. It is simply men choosing differently. And those choices compound. As more men withdraw, the social proof grows. Men talk quietly among themselves. They compare notes. They share observations. And when experiences align, confidence increases. Each man who opts out makes it easier for the next to do the same. This is how cultural shifts actually happen, not through speeches or campaigns, but through accumulated lived experience. Another aspect that deserves attention is how men are redefining success. For generations, success was tied to status, provision, and external validation. Now, many men define success as freedom from unnecessary stress, freedom from constant judgment, freedom from obligations that do not serve them, and freedom from systems that do not reciprocate. This redefinition is subtle but profound. It removes men from competitions they never agreed to. It decouples self worth from productivity and approval, and it places control back in the individual's hands. When success is defined this way, many traditional levers lose their power. Titles matter less, prestige matters less, social approval matters less. What matters is internal alignment. This is why men are less reactive, less defensive, less interested in debates. They are not trying to convince anyone of anything. They are simply living differently. And that quiet difference is what unsettles institutions the most because it cannot be easily addressed. There is no demand to negotiate with, no protest to suppress, no complaint to respond to, just absence. As this absence grows, the pressure on those who remain increases. Responsibilities redistribute, expectations rise, stress concentrates, and those dynamics become visible. This visibility often triggers resentment rather than reflection. Instead of asking why men left, the question becomes how to force them back. But force is ineffective when disengagement is voluntary and internal. Men who have found peace in withdrawal will not trade it for obligation. They have experienced both sides, and experience is decisive. This brings us to the most difficult truth of all. Trust, once broken at scale, does not regenerate automatically. It requires accountability, reform, and time. And none of those are currently present in sufficient measure. Without them, appeals for re engagement are premature. Men are not holding grudges, they are making calculations. And until those calculations change, behavior will not. What we are witnessing is not a temporary phase, it is a structural realignment of how men relate to society, one driven by incentives, experience, and adaptation. And it is still unfolding as this disengagement deepens. One of the most overlooked consequences is how it reshapes accountability itself. In systems where men once absorbed responsibility by default, accountability was often invisible. When something failed, men stepped in. When something broke, men fixed it. When conflict arose, men mediated, smoothed, and stabilized. Much of that labor was informal, unrecognized, and expected rather than requested. Now that men are stepping away from that role, accountability does not disappear. It simply reappears in places that were not accustomed to carrying it. This is why so many institutions feel brittle right now. Without that stabilizing presence, processes that once functioned through informal correction now require formal enforcement. Policies multiply, meetings expand, oversight increases, and yet outcomes do not improve. In fact, they often worsen because bureaucracy is a poor substitute for trust and initiative. Men understood this intuitively. They knew that systems worked not because they were perfect, but because people filled the gaps quietly. Once those people stop filling the gaps, the flaws become impossible to ignore. This exposure creates discomfort, and discomfort creates defensiveness. Rather than addressing the root causes of disengagement, many institutions respond by doubling down on the very mechanisms that drove men away in the first place. More monitoring, more compliance, more messaging, more moral framing, and each of these responses confirms what men already suspected, that participation will only increase scrutiny without increasing protection. At this stage, re engagement becomes even less likely. Men are not persuaded by promises of improvement that are not accompanied by structural change. They have seen too many cycles of apology followed by repetition. They have learned that words are cheap and patterns are decisive. Another long term consequence is the erosion of informal leadership. Leadership is not merely a title or a role, it is a behavior. It emerges when someone takes responsibility without being forced to. When men withdraw from that behavior, leadership does not automatically transfer, it often disappears. And without leadership, groups stagnate. This stagnation shows up in subtle ways. Decisions take longer, risk avoidance increases, innovation slows, conflict festers rather than resolving, and morale declines, not because people are working harder, but because no one feels safe taking initiative. In environments where initiative once carried respect, it now carries risk, and risk without reward is avoided. As this becomes normalized, younger men observe and internalize the lesson. They do not need to be convinced, they simply need to watch. They see which behaviors are punished and which are ignored. They see who is protected and who is expendable, and they adjust accordingly. This is how disengagement propagates across generations, not through ideology, but through observation. Young men learn early that visibility carries danger and that anonymity offers safety. They learn that restraint is rewarded more reliably than ambition, and they shape their lives around those lessons. This generational shift has profound implications for the future of work. Fields that rely on long term commitment, mentorship, and institutional loyalty struggle to attract and retain male participation. Roles that require public accountability without authority become increasingly undesirable. And organizations that fail to adapt find themselves staffed by individuals who meet minimum requirements but avoid ownership. This is not laziness, it is risk calibration. When taking ownership exposes you to consequences without corresponding control, ownership becomes irrational. Men understand this. They are not refusing to work. They are refusing to absorb liability for systems they do not govern. Another area where this shift is becoming visible is in interpersonal relationships. Men are no longer approaching relationships as default life paths. They are treating them as optional arrangements that must justify themselves through consistent benefit. This does not mean men are incapable of connection. It means connection is no longer assumed to be inherently valuable. This recalibration changes the dynamics of dating, partnership, and long term commitment. Men are no longer willing to subsidize uncertainty. They are no longer willing to invest heavily in relationships where expectations are fluid and accountability is one sided. And they are no longer willing to be judged retroactively for behaviors that were previously considered normal. As a result, relationships that do form tend to be more deliberate and more contained. They involve clearer boundaries, slower progression, and lower tolerance for instability. Many men simply opt out entirely, finding fulfillment in other areas of life that offer predictability and control. This opt out is often misunderstood as emotional shutdown. In reality, it is emotional conservation. Men are preserving their energy for environments where it produces positive outcomes rather than conflict. As disengagement becomes more common, social narratives begin to fracture. The old stories about duty, sacrifice, and obligation lose their persuasive power. New narratives emerge that emphasize autonomy, self preservation, and personal peace. These narratives resonate because they align with lived experience. Attempts to counter these narratives often rely on moral urgency rather than practical reform. They frame disengagement as a social failure rather than a rational response. But framing does not change incentives. And as long as incentives remain misaligned, behavior will remain unchanged. One of the most significant long term effects of this shift is how it alters negotiation itself. Negotiation requires leverage. It requires both parties to need something from the other. As men become more self sufficient and less dependent on social approval or external validation, their leverage increases. They need less. And when you need less, you are harder to pressure. This is why demands for re engagement often feel ineffective. They assume dependency that no longer exists. They assume fear of exclusion that no longer motivates. They assume guilt that no longer lands. Men who have already restructured their lives around independence simply do not respond to these levers. Over time, this leads to a rebalancing of power that many find unsettling, not because men are asserting dominance, but because they are withdrawing consent. Consent to expectations, consent to norms, consent to roles they did not choose. Withdrawal of consent is quiet but powerful. It does not require confrontation, it simply changes behavior. And behavior, once changed at scale, reshapes systems. This is why efforts to legislate or mandate engagement are unlikely to succeed. You cannot compel genuine participation through force without accelerating resentment and withdrawal. And you cannot shame people into caring about systems they no longer trust. The only viable path to re engagement would involve restoring trust through accountability, transparency, and fairness. It would require consequences for abuse of power. It would require consistent application of rules. And it would require acknowledgement of harm done. Without these elements, disengagement remains the rational choice. As time passes, disengagement becomes normalized. It stops being a reaction and becomes a baseline. Men who grow up in this environment do not see withdrawal as rebellion. They see it as common sense. And once something becomes common sense, it is very difficult to reverse. This normalization has cascading effects. Cultural expectations shift. Economic behaviors change. Social structures adapt. And systems that relied on outdated assumptions struggle to function. What many people fail to understand is that men are not waiting for permission to live this way. They have already done so. They have already built routines, habits, and identities that do not depend on participation in systems they view as unstable. And once built, these structures are resilient. This is Why appeals to nostalgia fall flat. They reference a past that no longer exists under current conditions. Men cannot return to roles that were viable only when trust and reciprocity were present. The future, then, is not defined by confrontation, but by divergence. Men and institutions move in different directions. Each adapts to its own logic. And where those logics no longer align, separation increases. This separation is not dramatic, it is gradual. It looks like fewer men in leadership pipelines, fewer men initiating relationships, fewer men volunteering, fewer men absorbing risk, and more men choosing quiet, contained lives. Over time, the cumulative effect becomes undeniable. Systems feel understaffed, not in numbers, but in initiative. Relationships feel transactional rather than organic. Communities feel fragmented, and yet men who have disengaged often feel more grounded than ever. This contrast fuels misunderstanding. Those still invested in the old structures view disengagement as abandonment. Men view it as self respect. And without shared assumptions, dialogue becomes difficult. What remains clear is that disengagement is not a phase, it is an adaptation. And adaptations persist as long as the environment that produced them remains unchanged. Men are not waiting to be convinced, they are waiting to see if reality changes. And until it does, they will continue to choose the path that offers the greatest stability and peace. That path increasingly is one of distance rather than involvement, and that distance continues to grow. As disengagement becomes more visible, culture itself begins to respond in predictable but ineffective ways. Narratives shift to explain the absence without addressing its cause. Language becomes softer on the surface, but more coercive underneath. Men are told they are needed again, but only conditionally. They are told they matter, but only if they comply. They are told their participation is essential, but only on terms they did not help shape. These contradictions do not go unnoticed. Men have learned to listen not to tone, but to structure. And the structure has not changed. Cultural messaging increasingly frames disengagement as a problem to be solved rather than a response to conditions. This framing is intentional. It shifts the responsibility away from systems and onto individuals. If men withdraw, it must be because they are broken, immature, fearful, or misguided. This absolves institutions of accountability while pathologizing self preservation. But men recognize this tactic. They have seen it before. And it only reinforces their decision to disengage further. When disengagement is framed as a flaw rather than a signal, reform becomes impossible. Signals are meant to be interpreted and responded to. Flaws are meant to be corrected or eliminated. By treating men's withdrawal as a defect, culture signals that it has no interest in understanding why it happened. Men take note of this. They see that their experience is not being heard, only managed. This is where attempts at reversal consistently fail. They focus on optics instead of outcomes. They emphasize inclusion without addressing risk. They celebrate participation without restoring trust. And they mistake compliance for engagement. Men may comply when forced, they may show up physically, but emotional and psychological engagement cannot be compelled. It must be earned. As a result, what returns is not participation, but performance. Men do the minimum required to avoid penalty. They follow rules precisely, they document everything, they avoid improvisation, and they disengage internally. This creates an illusion, normalcy, while hollowing out the substance that once made systems function smoothly. Over time, this hollowness becomes self sustaining. Systems designed around engagement begin to operate as if disengagement is normal. They lower expectations, they increase oversight, they reduce trust further. And in doing so, they lock in the very behaviors they claim to oppose. This pattern is especially visible in workplaces Leadership training emphasizes compliance over judgment. Risk management replaces initiative. Innovation is discussed but rarely practiced. And men who once might have taken chances now choose predictability. Not because they lack creativity, but because creativity carries exposure. In social life, the consequences are equally profound. Spontaneity fades. Informal social bonds weaken. Interactions become scripted. People rely on platforms, intermediaries, and structures rather than direct connection. And while this may reduce immediate risk, it also reduces depth. Men adapt to this environment by narrowing their circles. They invest in fewer relationships, but with clearer terms. They prioritize friendships that are stable and low drama. They avoid environments where ambiguity is high and consequences are asymmetric. This is not isolation, it is filtration. As this filtration becomes widespread, cultural expectations lag behind reality. Many still assume that men will eventually return to old roles once conditions improve slightly. But men are not waiting for improvement, they are waiting for transformation. And transformation requires more than language. One of the most difficult truths for institutions to accept is that trust cannot be negotiated, it cannot be demanded, and it cannot be restored through incentives alone. Trust is built through consistent protection over time. Men need to see that systems will not turn on them unpredictably. They need to see that rules apply equally. They need to see that evidence matters. And until they see that, disengagement remains rational. This is why symbolic gestures fall flat. Campaigns, statements, panels, none of these change lived experience. Men evaluate systems the same way they evaluate any environment. Does it reward competence? Does it punish malice? Does it protect the innocent? If the answer is unclear, they disengage. As disengagement hardens, something else happens that few are prepared for. Men stop arguing. Argument implies belief that persuasion is possible. It implies shared ground. Men who have disengaged no longer believe either exists, so they stop explaining, they stop defending, they stop debating. Silence replaces confrontation. This silence is often misread as agreement or defeat. It is neither. It is resolution. Men have resolved the question for themselves and moved on. And once that happens, external pressure loses relevance. This is why the cultural conversation feels increasingly one sided. Complaints grow louder, explanations grow more repetitive, but the audience they are aimed at is shrinking. Men who might have once responded are no longer listening, they are living elsewhere. The long term effect of this is cultural fragmentation, shared assumptions erode, common narratives break down, groups begin operating under different logics, and without shared logic, coordination becomes difficult. This fragmentation is not dramatic, it is subtle. It looks like confusion, it looks like miscommunication, it looks like policies that do not produce expected outcomes, and it looks like frustration on all sides. But men who have disengaged are not confused. They understand exactly what they are doing and why. They are not seeking validation, they are seeking stability. As years pass, disengagement becomes embedded in identity. Men who build their lives around autonomy and low exposure do not view themselves as missing out. They view themselves as having chosen wisely. Their sense of self is no longer tied to participation in unstable systems, and that makes them resilient to pressure. This resilience is often mistaken for stubbornness, but it is not rooted in defiance, it is rooted in alignment. When a man's actions align with his lived experience, he does not feel internal conflict. And without conflict, there is no leverage. This is the point at which reversal becomes nearly impossible, because even if conditions improve slightly, men who have adapted will not rush back. They have already paid the cost of change. They have already built new routines. They have already recalibrated expectations. Returning would require dismantling, a stable life for the possibility of something uncertain. Rational actors do not do that. This is why time does not heal this rift automatically. Time reinforces it. Each year of disengagement strengthens habits. Each year of stability without participation validates the choice. And each year without meaningful reform confirms original conclusions. Attempts to accelerate re engagement often worsen the situation. When pressure increases without protection, it signals desperation. When demands increase without trust, it signals entitlement. And when blame is assigned without accountability, it signals bad faith. Men recognize these signals immediately, and they respond by disengaging further. What remains is a widening gap between those who expect men to behave as they once did and men who no longer see any reason to do so. That gap is not bridged by messaging, it is bridged by change. And until change occurs, divergence continues. The most important thing to understand is that men are not trying to make a point. They are trying to live well. They are choosing the path that offers the highest probability of peace, stability, and self respect. Everything else is secondary. This is why disengagement persists even in the face of criticism. Criticism does not threaten men who no longer seek approval. It simply confirms their assessment. The future, then, is shaped not by confrontation but by parallel realities. Men who disengage build lives that function independently of systems that once depended on them. And those systems, in turn, must adapt or decline. Whether that adaptation happens remains to be seen. What is clear is that men are not waiting around to find out. They have already moved on. As this trajectory continues, one of the most important things to understand is that men walking away is not a collective decision, even though it appears coordinated from the outside. There are no meetings, no instructions, no shared doctrine. What exists instead is convergence. Thousands, then millions of men arriving independently at the same conclusion after navigating similar experiences. When independent paths converge repeatedly, it is not coincidence. It is pattern alignment. The men arrive here through different doors. Some come after a workplace incident that permanently alters their sense of safety. Some come after a relationship that collapses under asymmetrical expectations. Some come after watching another man lose everything with no recourse. Some arrive gradually, others all at once. But once they arrive, they recognize the landscape immediately. The signs are familiar, the rules are clear, and the path forward is obvious. That path is inward. Not inward as in isolation or bitterness, but inward as in self directed. Men stop outsourcing their sense of worth. They stop deriving identity from roles that can be revoked. They stop tying their future to systems that have demonstrated instability. And instead, they focus on what they can control: health, finances, skills, time, peace. This inward orientation is often misinterpreted as selfishness, but selfishness implies taking at the expense of others. What men are doing instead is refusing to give where giving has become hazardous. There is a difference. Withdrawal is not aggression, it is boundary enforcement. As more men adopt this orientation, society begins to experience something it has not had to confront in a long time: a reduction in unpaid emotional labor, a reduction in unreciprocated effort, a reduction in silent sacrifice. These reductions are not evenly distributed. They are felt most sharply in areas that relied on male contribution without acknowledging male vulnerability. This creates friction. Expectations collide with reality. Demands meet indifference. And indifference is not something that can be punished effectively because it is not defiance. It is disengagement. The systems that struggle most in this environment are those built on assumed participation. They assumed men would continue to show up, smooth over problems, and absorb consequences indefinitely. They assumed men would prioritize group stability over individual well being, and they assumed wrong. What replaces those assumptions is a new equilibrium, one that is less dynamic but more predictable. Men who disengage tend to structure their lives carefully. They minimize exposure to volatility. They choose routines that support consistency. They avoid environments where rules are unclear or selectively enforced. And over time, this creates pockets of stability that exist alongside broader instability. This divergence is not immediately obvious. On the surface, everything appears functional. Workplaces still operate, social spaces still exist, relationships still form, but beneath the surface, the energy has changed. The margin has disappeared. There is less resilience, less flexibility, less willingness to absorb shock. When stress increases, there are fewer buffers. When conflict arises, there are fewer mediators. When systems strain, there are fewer volunteers. And this lack is often noticed only after it is gone. Men who have disengaged observe these developments without surprise. They anticipated them, they accounted for them in their decisions. And this reinforces their confidence that disengagement was the correct choice. Another irreversible element of this shift is memory. Men do not forget what they learned. They do not forget how quickly circumstances turned. They do not forget how little protection existed when it mattered. And memory shapes future behavior more powerfully than hope. This is why apologies without reform do not work. Men have heard apologies before. They have seen them followed by repetition. Memory overrides rhetoric. Experience outweighs intention. As years pass, disengagement becomes part of personal identity. Men begin to describe themselves not in opposition to society, but in independence from it. They define success on their own terms. They choose simplicity over status, autonomy over approval, and predictability over excitement. This does not mean men reject all connection. It means they curate it. They are selective. They are deliberate. They choose relationships that are stable, reciprocal, and low risk. And they walk away quickly from anything that threatens that balance. And this selectivity is often misread as coldness, but it is actually discernment. Men are no longer willing to gamble emotional or financial resources on uncertain returns. They have learned the cost of doing so. As this mindset spreads, it alters social incentives. Attention becomes scarcer, commitment becomes conditional, and systems that relied on male investment without safeguards struggle to adapt. What many fail to grasp is that this shift does not require men to be unhappy. In fact, many report the opposite. They experience relief, clarity, a sense of control that was previously absent. They sleep better, they spend less, they worry less, and they feel grounded. This is deeply unsettling to narratives that depend on portraying disengagement as misery, because misery is persuasive, contentment is not. A man who is quietly content cannot be easily manipulated. This contentment is not loud. It does not seek validation. It does not announce itself. And that makes it difficult to counter. As disengagement solidifies, society faces a choice it has not yet fully acknowledged. Either address the structural conditions that drove men away, or adapt to a world where male participation is conditional rather than assumed. Neither option is easy. Both require relinquishing control. Most institutions attempt a third option: delay. They hope the trend will reverse on its own. They wait for men to return out of habit or nostalgia. But habits have already been broken, and nostalgia does not override lived experience. The longer disengagement persists, the less incentive there is to reverse it. Men who have built stable lives without reliance on unstable systems see no reason to re enter. The cost is too high, the reward too uncertain. This is why the conversation feels stalled. One side continues to demand, the other side has already left. And without both parties present, dialogue is performative, and men walking away are not trying to convince anyone. They are not asking for permission. They are not seeking agreement. They are simply choosing a path that aligns with reality as they have experienced it. This choice is deeply personal. It does not require consensus, it does not require validation, and it does not require explanation. Every man arrives at it alone in a quiet moment after a realization, after a pattern becomes undeniable. And once that realization takes hold, it cannot be undone by pressure. This is the part that many find hardest to accept. You cannot force someone to care about a system that does not care about them. You cannot shame someone into trust, and you cannot guilt someone into participation when participation carries unacceptable risk. Men have weighed the options, they have run the numbers, and they have chosen accordingly. The future that emerges from this choice is not chaotic. It is fragmented, it is quieter, it is more individualized, and it operates on different assumptions. Men who disengage do not expect rescue. They do not expect fairness from systems that have failed them. They expect only what they can provide for themselves. And that expectation is reliable. As more men adopt this stance, the collective landscape changes. The center of gravity shifts, and what was once unthinkable becomes normal. Men walking away is not a protest, it is not a rebellion, it is an adaptation. And adaptations persist until the environment changes fundamentally. Until then, men will continue to choose peace over participation, stability over exposure, and autonomy over obligation. They will continue to walk their own paths, and they will not be looking back. At the end of all of this, what remains is not outrage, not bitterness, and not chaos, but choice. That is the part so many people miss. Men walking away is not about anger toward women, institutions, or society as a whole. It is about men choosing the conditions under which they are willing to exist. It is about men deciding that their lives, time, reputations, and peace are not negotiable assets to be gambled in systems that have proven unreliable. When you strip away the noise, that is all that is left choice. Every man watching this understands something instinctively, even if he has never put words to it. There is a moment when you realize that the rules you were told to follow no longer protect you. There is a moment when you realize that effort does not guarantee safety, that good intentions do not shield you from consequences, and that participation itself has become the risk. That realization does not make you angry, it makes you sober, and sobriety changes how you move. Once that moment happens, you begin to see the world differently. You notice how often men are expected to give without assurance, to comply without protection, to sacrifice without recognition. You notice how quickly responsibility is assigned and how slowly accountability appears. And you notice that when things go wrong, the burden rarely falls evenly. These are not ideological observations, they are practical ones. Men who walk away are not trying to teach anyone a lesson. They are not trying to punish society. They are simply refusing to continue paying a cost that no longer makes sense. They are choosing environments where effort produces stability rather than exposure. They are choosing lives that are smaller on the outside but stronger on the inside. This is why so many men report feeling calmer after disengaging. The constant background tension fades. The need to monitor every word disappears. The fear of misinterpretation recedes. Life becomes quieter, slower, and more deliberate. That quiet is not emptiness, it is relief. And once a man experiences that relief, he does not forget it. He does not rush to give it up. He does not trade it for approval or validation. He protects it. This is the part that many critics do not understand. Men walking away are not waiting for society to improve before they return. They have already built lives that function without needing society's permission or approval. They have learned to rely on themselves, on small trusted circles, and on routines that support stability. They are not missing out, they are opting out. That opt out is not dramatic, it does not announce itself, it happens quietly. A man stops engaging where engagement carries risk. He stops explaining himself to people who are not listening. He stops volunteering for roles that expose him without protecting him. And one day, he realizes that he is no longer part of the game at all. And from the outside, this looks like absence. From the inside, it feels like alignment. What cannot be undone is the knowledge men now carry. Knowledge about how quickly narratives can shift. Knowledge about how little protection exists once accusation replaces evidence. Knowledge about how fragile trust really is. And once knowledge replaces assumption, behavior changes permanently. This is why attempts to reverse this trend feel hollow. They address surface symptoms without touching root causes. They promise inclusion without restoring trust. They demand participation without offering protection. And men see through that instantly. Men are not unreasonable. They are not incapable of cooperation. But cooperation requires fairness. It requires reciprocity. It requires clear rules applied consistently. And until those conditions exist, disengagement remains the rational choice. The future that emerges from this is not a collapse driven by hostility. It is a reshaping driven by withdrawal. Systems that adapt may survive in altered form. Systems that refuse to change may continue to struggle. But men will not wait around to see which outcome occurs. They have already moved forward. For the men watching this, the message is not what to do. It is not instruction. It is recognition. If you have felt this shift, you are not imagining it. If you have pulled back to protect yourself, you are not alone. And if you have found peace in doing so, you do not need to justify that to anyone. Your life belongs to you. Your time belongs to you. Your energy belongs to you. And you are allowed to decide where and how those things are spent. Men walking away is not about rejecting the world. It is about choosing yourself when the world has shown you that it will not choose you in return. It is about recognizing patterns and responding intelligently. It is about building a life that does not require constant defense. This path is not loud. It does not seek approval. It does not need validation. It simply exists, and that is why it endures. Before we close, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed today? Do you agree with what you are seeing and experiencing? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because this conversation matters more than most people are willing to admit. And as always, like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, Men Walking Away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.